Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of Hector Berlioz's Memoirs, published in 1865. Bear in mind, I am reviewing, it's a little bit complex, but I am reviewing the English translation, the original English translation by Rachel and Eleanor Holmes, originally published in 1884, but that translation was then revised again by Ernest Newman in 1932. That is the specific version that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, Hector Berlioz, French romantic composer, a very mercurial figure, a very complicated figure. Nowadays, probably most well known for the Symphonie Fantastique of 1830, a massive five movement orchestral work based upon his romantic feelings for a woman named Harriet Smithson. He also has works such as Harold in Italy, being another one of his most popular ones. He wrote some operas, which admittedly were not very successful, but his legacy seems to be in the kind of development of the Romantic Symphony, kind of steering away from the very German symphonic structure of your Mozarts and your Beethovens, etc., and kind of giving it a more a looser feel, I suppose, structurally, experimenting more with the idea of having multiple movements and not just having four, that sort of thing. Berlioz is someone who is difficult to talk about. His legacy has been a complex one for people to kind of unpack over the years. He was not very popular at the time that he died, and certainly not in the immediate aftermath of his death. So his works were not especially frequently played. But nowadays, where we're at is that Berlioz's work has received a sort of critical reappraisal in the last 60, 70 years or so. And nowadays we kind of look at some of these early symphonic works again, especially as being game changers, I suppose, and really important for the evolution of the symphony as a genre, and really just kind of unusual works for their time period as well. So there's a quote from someone basically saying that there's no way to feel impartial about the music of Berlioz and about his legacy. You either love him or you hate him. I happen to be in the former category personally. Berlioz also interesting in that he was an avid musical writer, maybe not quite the music critic that, say, a Robert Schumann was, but he was very opinionated. And that is a good thing for this work right here. The memoirs are... I'll be honest, I struggle with autobiography a little bit, especially the autobiographies and memoirs from this era that I have read. I remember reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and actually having it not click with me that much, but I was actually rather amazed at how good this was. Berlioz is a fantastic writer, and certainly the translation appears to have picked up the nuances of his writing especially well. And he's dynamic in a sense because he can tell a good yarn. And a lot of this book is him telling really interesting stories, full with this like mock dialogue, him recollecting specific conversations that may or may not have happened, who knows. And it's interesting to read that. It's also interesting just to read his perspective on music. I mean, he does not shy away from giving you opinions about all sorts of different composers and performers and other musical figures from the era. He's willing to be very full of praise. He's ready to praise people. He's ready to tear them down and be very blunt. I mean, he doesn't care. He will give his opinions very much unfiltered, and you get a lot of that throughout here. And it's super fascinating to read those pieces. The other side of it, too, is that you really get a sense of his psyche. He is very open with his feelings. He's very transparent about his mental state and how turbulent it was, to say the least. And you really get to see that mental state and that turbulence grow more frequent, and really sort of dismantle itself over time. Um, the organization of the memoirs is not very solid, I suppose. It is very disorganized because Berlioz was essentially working on this off and on for a number of years. He put it aside. I mean, he was writing a lot of this in the 1840s, but then you have kind of addendums from the 1850s and into the 1860s. You have letters that he wrote to different people that he uses as kind of storytelling devices, or that are used as storytelling devices here. And because of that, it comes across disorganized, but I think in a way that only serves to really emphasize the point that this guy he seemed to feel things very strongly, whether that was the sort of romantic piece of it, whether that was, him reflecting on his own career and getting down on himself in that sense, or just things that he cannot explain in general, mental attacks, if you will, that he can't justify or can't come up with a reason or an explanation for why they're happening. It's really interesting, and because of that, it gives the book a real tragic bent towards the end, because things just kind of start unraveling for him after a while. I mean, you get to read the successes. And it's really fascinating and really cool to see how he is received. There's a really nice little bit about him going back and forth with Mendelssohn, and Berlioz was not entirely sure if Mendelssohn would think very highly of him, and Mendelssohn goes on to be like super welcoming, and it's really nice and very validating for Berlioz as a musical figure. But that definitely, like I say, it starts unraveling towards the end. It starts tearing itself apart, and you really get there are footnotes and annotations throughout that kind of expand upon these pieces. If there are like large years-long gaps in the narrative, which there are on a couple of occasions, they will kind of explain what happened, and you really get, it gets to be pretty tragic and pretty dour towards the end, as he starts losing people in his life, and that just causes him to completely unravel. So yeah, there's a lot of depth here, and it's not just, I appreciated that there is that balance of Berlioz being frank and transparent and telling stories that are occasionally quite funny. He's a very engaging writer, like I say, but you do have that genuine kind of tragic human element to it as well. And I think that balance really defines like the idea of an artist in some ways, balancing those high highs with those low lows, that turbulence. I don't know. I think it speaks to something about the artistic condition, this book does. And where we sit with it now, having read it, I think it's phenomenal. And if you have an interest in Berlioz and you have not read it, I would highly recommend it. If you don't have an interest in Berlioz, or if you're not really familiar with classical music, with the Romantic era, I don't know how much you're going to get out of this. But I do think that if you do have that familiarity, and let's say that you are already familiar with the story of Mozart or a Beethoven or somebody like that, I think this will be worth your time on some level. And I think that, I think the story of Berlioz really exemplifies these characteristics of the artistic story, like I said. So, that's all I've got, really. So I hope this interests you, and if you check it out, let me know. But thanks so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Tell a friend as well. Thanks so much, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.